As the 2019 coaster season has ended, I figured it's time for me to update my top coasters video from last year. In 2019, I visited a ton of new parks as well as spent a ton of time at Cedar Point working there. As such, many of my opinions have changed. Keep in mind that I've only ridden about 120 different coasters, and a few of the parks I've visited this year had some of their major rides closed, like Sky Rush at Hershey Park. Also, all of these opinions are just that, my opinions. You do not have to agree. Before we get started, here are some coasters that didn't quite make my top 20, but still are worth mentioning. Gemini. As many of you know, I worked this ride all season and I've test ridden it many times. That first drop is still spectacular, and on a trimless ride you can expect airtime on almost every hill. Of course, we can't forget that head chopper before the mid-course brake run, as it's one of the best on any ride I've ridden to this day. Gemini was one of the first big coasters I rode, and it's also the first coaster I worked, and I just love this ride. Millennium Force is a ride that many of you probably expected to be much higher, as last year it was actually my number 2 coaster. But this year this ride has really disappointed me. The first drop has always been very underwhelming, and while the first turn is quite intense, the rest of the ride is very boring, and especially this year it's lacked almost all of its airtime. Even some very fun rides on Associate Ride Night in the fog at midnight were not enough to push this ride into my top 20. This ride's fun, but it's nothing to write home about. Viper at Six Flags Darien Lake. This aero looper has an outstanding first drop in the back row. Following that, you have a super intense vertical loop and a super intense batwing. This whole section of the ride is quite smooth, but once you hit that mid-course brake run, unfortunately the ride loses a lot of its speed. You get those corkscrews, which do give you some good hang time, but it's nothing to write home about and very similar to other aero loopers. As a whole, this ride is great, but I wish the second half was a little faster. Ride of Steel at Six Flags Darien Lake is very much like a miniature Millennium Force. The drop is very underwhelming, much like Millennium Force. And while this ride does have some airtime hills at the end that definitely set it above Millennium Force for me, it's still probably my least favorite hypercoaster, but still a good ride. Tantrum at Six Flags Darien Lake is the last of the 3 great but not quite top 20 worthy coasters at Six Flags Darien Lake. This ride reminds me a lot of Wonder Woman Golden Lasso Coaster in that it's very fast paced and the elements it has are really great and intense. However, the ride itself is just too short to make it into my top 20. Raging Bull. Before riding this ride, I really did not know what to expect. I had heard online that you have to ride in the back, and so I did. And man, let me say, that first drop is incredible. One of the best drops on any coaster in the world. You get absolutely flung, and then you dive right back down into that tunnel. That was amazing, and at that point I thought it might be one of my favorite coasters ever. However, then the rest of the ride happened, and while the rest of the ride has some forces and it definitely gets some points for originality, this ride's really all about that first drop. Diamondback is the first B&M Hyper I ever rode, and while the first 2 hills are actually quite good and give quite strong floater airtime, the rest of the ride is very underwhelming. That first drop in particular, which on B&M Hypers is known to be a very good drop, well, Diamondback is certainly the exception, because that drop is very underwhelming on Diamondback. And the rest of the ride, especially after that mid-course brake run, is very underwhelming, as you don't really get much airtime on the airtime hills returning to the station, and the helix is forceless, but at least, the splashdown's cool. As a whole, this ride just has a lot of wasted potential.
It's out there, waiting, something so terrifying, so menacing, it could only be called.
Viper at Six Flags Great America is one of my favorite rides, and this ride really surprised me. Going in, I didn't know what to expect, and that first turn leading up to the lift hill was kind of rough, so I was kind of worried. But as soon as we dropped off that drop, I knew I would love this ride. It's just got airtime all over the place. That double down on the second turnaround, I believe, yes. That double down provides some amazing airtime. The PTC trains allow you to get so much room. Oh, it's just an awesome wooden coaster. It was actually my favorite wooden coaster for a short amount of time. It may not be the largest ride in the world, but man, this thing packs a punch. Definitely ride it anytime you go to Great America. It's just such a great ride. Six Flags has kept it super smooth. It is just an awesome, awesome ride. Lightning Racer at Hershey Park is just a great ride. Racing coasters are always fun, and unlike most GCIs, it has a lot of airtime even with those awful restraints. It's a very long and drawn out ride. I actually thought it was over when we were hitting that giant helix, but we were actually in the middle of the ride. There's just airtime all over the place. You're racing the other train. It's just a fun time. It's not rough, but it's also not smooth. It feels like a wooden coaster. It's a great ride. I hope it never leaves this park. It's awesome, and it's actually my number one GCI. Great Bear at Hershey Park is my number one B&M invert. It's got great positive forces all over this ride, but right after you drop off that lift hill, you're treated to a helix right at the top of the lift, which I initially thought would be quite pointless and forceless, but after riding I can say it's exactly the opposite. Right at this helix, it starts to rip your feet off before the ride even starts. Then you drop down into quite a forceful vertical loop, followed by quite a forceless Immelman. But after that, you're treated to a 0G roll and a corkscrew, which are outstandingly whippy. And at night, you actually get such a crazy temperature change flying over the river like that it actually adds to the ride experience. Not to mention, unlike most intense B&M inverts, this one is super smooth. It's just a great overall ride. Steel Force at Dorney Park is a very overlooked ride. Going in, I really did not know what to expect, but after riding, I can say it is packed with floater airtime. Also, that helix, which I thought would just be kind of long, drawn out, and forceless, was actually really intense. The airtime, it's not the greatest. It's not, Magnum level ejector or anything, but it's quite strong floater airtime. In fact, this ride reminds me a lot of Magnum, which we'll see later on this list, but it's just with floater airtime instead of ejector. Also, compared to Magnum, the transitions are quite a bit smoother, so if you're someone who cares a lot more about transitions than me, you'll likely appreciate this ride. Intimidator at Carowinds is actually a B&M hyper most people don't like, but however, I have to disagree. While many people say there are trim brakes on a lot of the hills, they are definitely right. However, the trim brakes don't really affect the airtime, and you still get great floater, at least in the back, over almost every hill. Unlike Diamondback, which gives hardly any airtime. The ride overall is quite long, and it's just a great ride.
Baby, I'm ready to go.
Top Thrill Dragster is a Cedar Point classic. This ride is super intense, and after riding the taller version King Dakar, I can say this ride is definitely superior. It's got a great theme with that launch audio, as well as this ride has only lap bars to hold you in for that super intense ride experience. And while that ride experience may be over super fast, it is a great few seconds. This ride is down a lot, and I honestly don't expect it to exist for that much longer, but I love to ride it when I can. It is just a great ride.
There's a certain kind of storm out west. An eerie calm foretells its coming, with a thunderous rumbling like the sound of 1,000 hooves pounding the plain. So close you can feel it. You're far from calm before this storm, and before you can blink.
Storm Runner at Hershey Park has the most intense launch I have ever experienced. And unlike Dragster, there's quite an exciting layout after that launch, not just a top hat and then a brake run. You actually get quite a good layout, and those inversions that are a part of that layout actually feel really high above the ground. That flying snake dive, you look down mid-flying snake dive and you're flying 100 feet over the midway. It's awesome. This ride I really hope sticks around and avoids lots of the curses the other Intimate accelerators have. Wonder Woman Golden Lasso Coaster at Six Flags Fiesta Texas is an insanely fast-paced ride. It has some of the strongest airtime on any coaster I have ever experienced. The inversions are pretty fun and also taken at a super fast pace. Not to mention, these restraints are the best vest-style restraints in the world. Why is it not higher? Well, unfortunately, the ride time is very short, which does tend to happen when you have a super fast-paced ride. Other than that, this ride is perfect. Maverick at Cedar Point is another super fast-paced ride. That first drop is insane and absolutely ejects you out of your seat in the back row. Following that, you have some great back and forth transitions. 1 second you're thrown down into your seat, and the next second you're ejected out at some of the strongest airtime at Cedar Point. And then the ride stops. You think it's over. But before you know it, you're back to 70 miles per hour to do the whole thing over again. And not in reverse, you actually get a whole nother section of the ride, and it is awesome. This ride is very intense, and actually for a long time was my #1 coaster. As a whole, though, I tend to get dragged onto it with friends and family that visit the park, and it just isn't worth the wait times it's been getting ever since Steel Vengeance opened. However, it's still a great ride. Nitro is the best B&M hyper I have ever done. That first drop is absolutely stunning, and you get strong floater airtime over almost every hill. The turnaround section is a lot like Diamondback, but this one actually has forces. The helix before the mid-course, unlike Diamondback's helix, pulls a lot of strong G's that actually made me gray out. And following that mid-course, which doesn't slow you down a whole lot, at least when I rode it, you actually get some pretty decent airtime over those last few hills. This ride is just awesome, and not to mention on those last few hills, you get a great view of that first drop, which is something I really enjoy on coasters, and you'll see that with the upcoming coasters on this list. Phoenix at Knoebels is a ride I did not know what to expect going into. This ride, really from POVs, just looked like your generic old, slower PTC coaster, maybe with some good airtime pops, but nothing special. But then I rode it. And basically take your normal, old, dull wooden coaster at any other park, make it perfectly smooth, and remove the restraints, and you will get Phoenix. This ride is packed with unexpected airtime over every hill. Even the turnarounds give airtime, which is strange but awesome. At points, my belt line was above the back of the seat. It genuinely scared me my first ride. I could not breathe when I got off. It was that crazy. The last few hills legitimately try to kill you. If you ever wanted to see what a coaster was like without seatbelts or lap bars, this is the ride for you. I don't know how this ride exists, but I'm glad it does.
Do you dare challenge the giant?
Goliath at Six Flags Great America is a great RMC. This ride, the first drop is great as it plunges you down into that tunnel and then back up into a lot of interesting elements. First you get an airtime hill, followed by quite a strange inversion, followed by a 0G stall. And during that 0G stall, which feels like it lasts forever, if you look up, which will actually make you look down at the ground, it just gives you such a disorienting, awesome experience. This ride is strange, but it's great. The airtime is quite strong, and as a whole, it's just an awesome ride. If it was longer, it would place higher for sure. However, as is, it's just great. Fury 325 at Carowinds is the best B&M I have been on. That first drop is absolutely stunning. It's a super long drop, and it actually reminds me a lot of a drop tower, but then as soon as the drop is over, you actually have a good coaster afterwards. It's great. You have some great high bank turns that, unlike Millennium Force, provide a little bit of forces. And you just kind of fly around the whole entrance of the park and get some great views of the entranceway, and you get to kind of scream at some guests walking into the park, which is kind of cool. And then after that, you actually have some airtime hills that do provide airtime, actually quite strong airtime. Some would even call it ejector. You do have quite a long drawn-out helix that does kill the pacing a bit as it's quite forceless, but you do at least get quite the head chopper in the middle of that helix with one of the supports. So it's quite fun. But then after that, you have a few more airtime hills before the brake run. Overall, this ride may not be the best steel coaster in the world, but it's certainly one of the best.
Welcome.
It's here, and there's no turning back. From its 228-foot plunge, speeds up to 82 miles an hour. 3 terrifying passes through the Thunderbolt, and a few other surprises. It's ready. Are you?
Revenge will be mine.
Phantom's Revenge at Kennywood is what you get when you cross an Aero Looper with a Morgan Hyper. That lift hill is super slow and drawn out and loud, just like an Aero Looper, because, well, it is the lift hill from an Aero Looper. Following that, you get a very arrowy kind of first drop that is just like the kind of drop you'd find on an Aero Looper from the early 90s. After that, you get the second drop, the famous second drop. That leads into a very intense low to the ground turn, as well as some nice overbank turns, including the head chopper moment with the Thunderbolt, which I didn't find to be as good as some people said. But then the highlight of the ride hits, as you hit some hills that, well, take a B&M Hyper, which has hills that are about 100 feet tall. Now condense those hills down to 10 feet tall, and you get Phantom's Revenge. Because this thing absolutely throws you out of your seat, and then because the hills are so shallow, you get thrown right back down, and you feel all that airtime, because these restraints are some of the best restraints on any coaster ever. They leave so much room. These hills are super powerful, and you get a few more of them before you hit the brake run, and while this section of the ride is pretty fast, it makes the ride so good that it definitely deserves a spot at my number 5. Iron Rattler at Six Flags Fiesta Texas. Maybe a short ride, but 2 elements make this ride absolutely stand out. The first drop is the best on any RMC I have ever been on, and I really was not expecting it. It's actually one of the best first drops I've ever experienced, because that first drop, not only is it right down off that quarry wall, but it's also twisted to the side. So as soon as you start dropping and getting that great airtime, you just get flung to your left. It is awesome. Then you dive underneath sort of a tunnel. It's more of a covered structure into a little step up, which gives you some good airtime. And then you get a bank turn, followed by the first RMC inversion, which is nothing too special, but it's still pretty cool. But then you're up on the quarry wall, and while the ride kind of meanders here, it's not as slow as some people have said. The ride is sort of teasing you at this point as to what you're about to experience as you go over the last airtime hill on the quarry wall, which doesn't give very much airtime. You get the most insane drop in the middle of the ride that exists, because you drop right off that quarry wall again, getting the same great airtime as you did on the first drop, and then you dive into a pitch black tunnel. However, the second you emerge from that tunnel, you hit the brake run. So yes, this ride is short, but those 2 elements really do hold this ride up as one of the greatest, and it still deserves a spot at my number 4. Steel Vengeance is a ride I'm sure a lot of you expected to be higher. It is my number 1 RMC, and this ride just has so much airtime. The problem is that none of that airtime is that strong. The best airtime moment is certainly the step up onto the mid-course, as that's really the only true moment of ejector I found on this ride, at least this year. And I say this year because Steel Vengeance is legitimately running slower, at least was running slower in 2019 than it did in 2018, which is probably why it ranked as number 1 last year for me, but I also hadn't ridden as many great rides. This ride does still have a lot of airtime, and your thighs will be aching by the end of the ride due to just how much airtime there is in this ride. The ride is super long, and that definitely helps make the ride worth waiting for in these super long lines this ride does get. I mean, the real reason why this ride is not any higher is because I prefer less stronger airtime as to more weaker airtime like Steel Vengeance has. That's not a bad thing, it's just all about preference. Some people will like a lot of airtime even if it's not as strong, which is what Steel Vengeance has. Those bulky restraints, and I get why they have to have such bulky restraints, definitely do take away from some of that airtime as well. Overall, Steel Vengeance is an amazing ride, but it's not my number 1. Magnum XL200 was the first hypercoaster, and it is still the best. Going to break this ride down piece by piece, as it is my favorite coaster. This summer I rode it 110 times, and I have a great knowledge on how to ride this ride, and man, do I love Magnum. So, first thing that happens is you pull out of the station. You get a little small dip and a turn here. This small dip will provide some RMC-like airtime in the back, sort of like the hills before Steel Vengeance. And the turn reminds me of the first turn before the lift on Iron Rattler if you ride in the front. Then you engage with the nice, awesome-sounding Aero lift hill. pleasure of hearing almost all summer, because from the Gemini platform you can hear it. And so you engage with that lift, and you get ready for a very long, I timed it, it's about a minute long climb to the top of that lift hill. And from the top of that lift hill, day or night, you are going to get an amazing view. If you look behind you, you'll see the entirety of Cedar Point behind you. You'll get to experience the fact that you are at Cedar Point, you've made it, and you are on the best coaster, in my opinion, there. And so you are climbing up that lift hill. Straight in front of you, you get a view of Lake Erie, and if it's night, all you see is darkness in front of you, and that's the direction you're going. So as soon as you crest the top of that record-breaking lift hill, oh boy, here you go, down that first drop. And the first drop really does not give that great, but it really doesn't give airtime. I'm not gonna lie here. You're gonna reach speeds of 72 miles per hour, and then actually the pull out from that drop is quite intense, and will probably, if you have your arms up, pull them back down. You're gonna get some good positive G's there. Then you're gonna crest the second hill. If you're in the front of the train, basically if you're in car 1 or car 2, you're gonna get some decent airtime over that second hill. And if you're in the back, you're just gonna kind of get pulled over it. But it's gonna give you a second to breathe, because now the great part of the ride is starting. So you're going to get a second to breathe. You're going to look around. You'll see, if you're riding at night, which is the best time to ride a lot of the coasters at Cedar Point, Magnum included, you are going to get a great view of the pitch black darkness in front of you, because all you can see is the darkness of Lake Erie straight in front of you, and you are diving down in a second right into that tunnel. So you're actually going to make a turn to the left, which is a kind of forceful little turn. You can tell it was definitely a Ron Toomer designed turn as you dive down into the first tunnel, which is absolute pitch black. Now you're going to emerge from that tunnel into one of my favorite airtime moments on any ride ever, and that is this Flowjector hill. And it's honestly more ejector than floater, at least depending on how the ride is running. It's a very long and drawn out hill. So you sort of fly up into it, and then you are just floating there, and you're actually pinned up against the restraint, floating there for quite a long time. It's actually a really interestingly profiled hill. And now you're going to pass over the trim brakes, and one of two things will happen, and this is going to determine how good the rest of the ride is. Either one, the most common thing, that you're going to engage with the trims and the rest of the ride will be great. Not top 3 in the world or anything, but great. Or you are going to hear nothing, and you are going to take that turn so fast, that awesome pretzel turnaround that's honestly the worst part of the ride for sure, but you are going to take it fast enough that you may even gray out. It is so strong, very intense when it's trimless. If it's trimmed, you're just going to kind of bump around on it and just enjoy it as a brief moment to breathe, but if it's trimless, it will be intense. Following that, you're going to drop out of that pretzel turn and into an airtime hill enclosed in the second tunnel. Now this airtime hill, if you got a trimmed ride, is going to be okay. You might get a little bit of floater, but if you have a trimless ride, it will provide just as good of ejector as the next few hills we're coming up to. Then you get another hill, just like the one in the tunnel. Following this, you get a kind of off-axis hill that sets you up for the airtime alley. Now this off-axis hill on a normal ride is just kind of an awkward hill, but on a trimless ride, it feels like an RMC. It's so strange and weird and sideways airtime. You know the experience if you've ridden an RMC. It feels just like that, except these restraints are the absolute freedom aero restraints, not the bulky RMC ones. So anyway, now you are onto the airtime alley. The first hill here may disappoint you, especially if you got a heavily trimmed ride, as you will only get light ejector or maybe just even floater. But then the next hill is where you first experience the greatness of the airtime alley, which is always talked about. Even people that don't like Magnum always credit the airtime alley as being awesome. So you're going to get this first hill. It lets you appreciate just how tall the coaster is, because you get a great view of that first drop. And man, this ride may be 30, now 31 years old, but man, it still is tall. It is tall. Even compared to other rides in the park, it still feels tall. And so you get a great view of that first drop. And now you pop into the third hill on the airtime alley, and again you're getting great ejector airtime here, and I've actually felt the same trimmed or trimless. Great ejector regardless of if it's trimmed or trimless. And here you're going to want to smile for your photo as you pass the photo the camera for the photo, and now you are getting into the final hill, which is actually enclosed in the newly rethemed tunnel. The final tunnel, which actually now has fog, lights, and various music tracks that play. It sort of sells the whole time travel theme. Dive into the final tunnel. You're going to get some pretty strong airtime in there. Probably just as good as the hill with the camera. Those two are probably the strongest two airtime moments. Again, very short moments of airtime. It's not like the sustained hill before the turnaround, but you're going to get some pretty good airtime there. And then you will pop into the brake run, and the pop into the brake run will give you some decent airtime if you are in the front of the train. If you're in the back, you're just going to get you're going to get no airtime, I'm not going to lie. And one of two things will happen. You are either going to slam to a hard stop, or you are going to roll right through and into the ready brakes. If you slam to a hard stop, then the crew is being slow or something else has happened and you triple stacked. Ouch, that hurts. But that's all a part of the fun of Magnum. It's always a gamble with Magnum, and that is why I love it. Every single ride is different. I mean, I've ridden it 110 times, and no two rides are the same. Every time it is different. You always want to leave some room in between the lap bar and your lap. If you can't leave a lot of room, always tighten that seatbelt so it's the thing holding you down. But they did actually add padding on the lap bars this year, and that certainly has made a lot more people appreciate Magnum. I know a lot of people complain that this ride hurts, and on my 110 rides, including some which I tried to staple myself, I didn't get hurt. You know, I was fine. Other rides have certainly hurt me more than Magnum. Magnum is great. It is one of the best coasters in the world. 30 years old, my personal favorite coaster. It may be old, but it is still easily one of the best in the world. El Toro. I said Magnum was one of the best because El Toro is the best. Wow, this ride is stunning. This ride, I did not know 100% what to know when I went in. I kind of expected it to be kind of a top 10 worthy coaster, but I didn't really know what I was getting into. So the ride starts with a pretty quick turn out of the station, leading to the super tall 181-foot tall cable lift hill. And so as soon as you engage with that lift, you are going to immediately start to just fly up it. It's not like a lot of other coasters where you get time to appreciate it. Nope. You are going right up that lift hill super quickly, just like Millennium Force's lift hill, because it's a cable lift. And then once you get up to the top, you're going to get a nice view of the whole park. You're going to see just how high up you are, although it's kind of dwarfed because you are next to King Ka, which feels a lot taller, but, you know, it is what it is. It's just placement of the ride. You can't really help that. But you are super high up there, one of the taller wooden coasters in the world, actually. And you're going to get a nice slow scenic turn that's going to give you quite the build-up, because you are about to experience one of the craziest coaster moments on the planet. So I always liked the back on El Toro, and so you're going to start to see as you approach the end of that turnaround, the front of the train slowly dipping down in front of you. And you know the inevitable is about to happen, and you cannot stop it. So it's one of the most terrifying coaster moments in the world, because you are there slowly starting to speed up on that turnaround. Meanwhile, the front of the train starts to dive off, and you know the inevitable is about to happen. So you crest over that drop. Oh man, that's when the insanity starts. In the back, you plunge down one of the strongest drops on any coaster. You will be absolutely thrown out of your seat with some of the strongest airtime on any coaster I have ever experienced. I've heard from someone that it pulls negative 2 Gs. It is that strong. And then, as you're being pulled out of your seat, you are going to have a strange desire to duck, because you are flying right under the structure of the ride with an insane head chopper right after the first drop. And before you know it, you're going to get a nice bit of positive Gs as you fly up into the second hill, which is going to give you just as strong airtime as you just got over the first drop. And then as you dive off that second hill, you're going to go right back into a similar maneuver as you just pulled, as you get a little bit more positive Gs before flying up into another insane ejector airtime hill. All three of those airtime moments are the strongest airtime I think I have ever experienced on a coaster, and you can literally hear the airtime. Yeah, that sound is the upstop wheels spinning super quickly as they are pulled into the track, because you are absolutely thrown into those airtime hills. It's all about the profiling of those hills. They are super drawn out, strong ejector hills. So now you're going to fly into a turnaround, which is quite intense. It's going to give you some pretty good positive Gs. This is actually the only spot on the ride I would even consider rough. The rest of the ride feels absolutely butter smooth. I mean, at least for a wooden coaster, butter smooth. You're going to get some decent positive Gs there. And now you are going to pull out of that turnaround. You're going to go to a section of the ride that a lot of people consider a dead zone. I don't really consider it a dead zone because the airtime here is about what you would get on, say, a GCI or even on a B&M Hyper. It's like that kind of strong-ish airtime. It's floater, but compared to what you just experienced, it does feel weak. I'm not going to lie there. But yeah, it feels weak, but it's nothing bad. It just kind of sets you up for the next portion of the ride. So then you're going to fly into a turn that goes right by the station. And right here, there's actually just some random supports that are up there just for another head chopper. I forgot to mention in those airtime hills, you fly through the structure and get some good head choppers there as well. And then you're actually going to go into one of the most famous parts of the ride, and that is the Rolling Thunder Hill. So when El Toro was built, there was another ride there called Rolling Thunder. It was a racing wooden coaster, and they had to build this hill to go over that ride. And that caused the profiling to be pretty darn insane. So you are going to get absolutely thrown from your seat, which is, I mean, it's crazy because you just had that break in the action, and now you're going to get another section where you're absolutely thrown from your seat. It is crazy. You don't expect it, and there's no way to brace yourself for it. It's just crazy. There's no way to be prepared for it. It's just as strong as the other few airtime moments. And then you're going to fly down, and you're going to get what I like to call the world's best GCI moment, because you are just going to get flown left to right to left, again, really close to the ground. It reminds me a lot of Maverick, so it's very Intimidator in that sense. I mean, Maverick was, a year later, so I think there was probably some crossover there in the design, because it absolutely throws you after you get ejected on the Rolling Thunder Hill right back down into your seat, and you get some quick, fast, intimate transitions on a wooden coaster. It's awesome. After that, you're going to get a few more hills that provide just like GCI level airtime, nothing too special, before you hit that final brake run, and you can catch your breath. El Toro, especially that first half, is a masterpiece. There is no spot on this ride that is bad. There are weaker parts of the ride, for sure, but it's better than the weaker parts of this ride alone are better than any other wooden coaster on Earth. So once you add in the strong portions of this ride, which are the best of any coaster you could ever experience, oh my gosh, I love El Toro. This is definitely a back row coaster, mostly just because of that first drop. It was just great. El Toro is the definition of a perfect coaster. As we move into 2020, I look forward to seeing if I can find any other coasters that might be able to beat it. I know for sure I will be taking a visit to Six Flags Magic Mountain, and X2 certainly has a chance at it, as well as Intimidator 305 if I ever have a chance to go there. And also this year I didn't get to ride Sky Rush because it was closed at Hershey Park, so there's a few rides that come to mind when I think of rides that might be able to be in my top 3. However, for the time being, I am very happy with my top 3 coasters, and El Toro as itself is just an outstanding ride. And I do wish, as much as I dislike Intamin as a company, I do wish more of these prefabs existed, because they are so much better than RMCs. I get they're probably more expensive, and I know Great Adventure has done an amazing job maintaining this thing because it is so smooth. And as a whole, El Toro is just unbeatable. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.